Morning, everybody. Welcome to today's session. We will start in a second or so. I will introduce Kyle and Mayor Geordin Hill-Lewis. But just to say thank you for coming. I know it's not too early. It's 10 o'clock. It's a reasonable time. And that you've had good coffee. I think today is a really fascinating discussion, although it's focused on Kyle's investigative work, which is put together in a book called Sabotage. And everybody's interested about Eskom, plans for the future, the electricity crisis. There are also global developments in the energy sector. I mean, we won't go into that, but it's always relevant to keep that in mind. But a little bit about myself. I'm Saliem Fakir. I run a new foundation called the Africa Climate Foundation. Very active in the energy sector in South Africa, but we also have interesting work in Senegal, Nigeria, lots of interesting stuff, similar kinds of issues. So it's real pleasure for me to be able to chair this and engage Kyle and the mayor on the book and outside of the book, if we can do that. So we're going to go for 40, 45 minutes, and then we will have one question at a time. You can address it to anybody here. Don't address it to me, but definitely Kyle and Geordin. So, Kyle, if I may kick off with you, I think first it will be good to understand your background and your role in investigative journalism. What are the reasons you wrote the book? And I presume it's got to do with Eskom files at News 24. And I just want to say, you know, I think from my point of view, I read the book literally twice. And I've been involved in this field for 10, maybe over 15 years, particularly in the energy sector. Very rarely do you get the inside story of what's going on in Eskom. When we look at Eskom, it's largely perception from outside. But the details of what goes on is, one, it's really interesting, but also scary. Yeah. And I have a couple of questions around the elements of the issues that you raise in the book. But if we can start off with that, and then May, I'll go to you next.
Yeah. So as part of my work at News 24, you know, we're a team of 4 investigative reporters, and we, in early 2021, we were given a large, and I use that word purposefully, a large selection of files that took us quite a while to get a handle on and start working through. And it was mainly centered around massive amounts of corruption at Kusile, which, you know, for the benefit of those in the audience who don't know, it's one of our 2 major new coal-fired power stations that broke ground in around 2007, 2008. They were supposed to be finished between 5 and 6 years ago. They're still not finished. They double over budget. They, you know, many years late. And the documents effectively set out, you know, root and twig of corruption at Kusile. Right. So we started publishing a whole bunch of stories around that. And you know, you don't just take a document and write a story on it. You speak to people, you investigate, you try and dig a bit deeper. And I figured out towards the end of the year, you know, I was on contract to write a book for Penguin, and I thought, oh, well, what on earth am I going to write about? And my publisher and I were having this discussion, Marita and I were talking, and it just clicked. You know, I've spent a year, maybe a bit more, digging into Eskom. What we're missing is a big picture story. Right. So let's tell the big picture story. And fortunately, in that year's worth of investigation, and this speaks to transparency and getting in the inside track, we managed to build relationships. We managed to cultivate sources. We managed to look in detail at things that have never been looked at Eskom before. And in doing that, we realized that the doors had actually been opened. You know, I think any journalist in the country who has an impetus to work on Eskom could probably go to Eskom right now and ask for information and get it. Whereas 3 years ago, that would have been impossible. 4 years ago, impossible. And that's really how it was such an important time to sort of capitalize on that. But the problem becomes is that the people that are there now that have opened the doors won't be there forever. Right. So we need to dig, and we need to make hay while the sun shines as quickly as possible. Because what this does is the door can be closed again, but they can never close it as successfully, because now we know too much about what's actually cooking.
So if I can just pick up a couple of things, I think it would be useful to, for the audience to understand the importance of Eskom, because I think the challenge we have is, despite the fact your book talks about sabotage specifically, there are other issues with Eskom. It has huge debt. Perhaps there's also reforms in the play to split up Eskom. And the world of electricity markets are changing. They're becoming a lot more dynamic. There's cheaper sources of energy and so on. Yeah. But in your book, you also touched about Eskom in the past, and there was a very good period of Eskom. I remember when I was reading Eskom's balance sheet, in fact, it was a company in the black, not in the red.
That's right.
And suddenly now we've got a 400 billion debt problem. But there are some strategic challenges with Eskom. And then, Mayor, I will come back to you around the strategy that the municipalities are pursuing. If you can just talk a little bit about, effectively, Eskom is a choke point. Yes. In other words, if Eskom failed, the entire South African economy is at risk. Yeah. Just to talk about that a little bit.
Saliem, not only the economy, but our very livelihoods and safety as well. I often use this example because it's the only recent one that we have to refer to. If you look at what happened in Venezuela in the last couple of years, they had massive blackouts. Electricity was gone for weeks at a time. Rioting started within a couple of days. Looting started within a few days. Unfortunately, we had a slight foreshadowing in July last year, and not to minimize the fact that 300 people died in July, but those riots were very opportunistic and obviously instigated by, some elements of political dissidents. The kind of rioting I'm talking about, if the electricity goes off right now and stays off for 2 weeks, will be catastrophic. Right. I don't think this country would ever recover from it. Right. Not mentally, not physically, not financially. Right. South Africa is in an extremely precarious position as we are right now. Everything seems fine when you walk out the door and you drive down the road. Everything functions well and everything looks okay. We're in danger of being grey-listed because we're not doing enough to control money laundering. Terrorists could be pushing money through our banks right now. We don't know that. We've had successive ratings downgrades over the years. It's fluctuated, but people don't want to bring money here. The biggest reason people don't want to bring money here is because there isn't a stable electricity supply. There are lots of other considerations. There are overactive unions who are not, people don't engage with them properly, and they, sort of control the way that companies hire and fire. But let's talk about electricity just as an example. So load shedding is a symptom of a system that has deteriorated and broken down over many, many years. And it's inconvenient and it's not really fun, but it's a sign. It's the outward showing manifestation of a deeper problem. Right. So to put this into perspective, South Africa's peak demand in winter just past was about 30, let's call it 30,500 megawatt. Obviously, we fell short of meeting that in some cases. On average, about a quarter of Eskom's generation capacity is offline due to breakdowns. That's about 16,000 megawatt out of a build capacity of 46,000 megawatt. For economic growth to happen, we need to fill a gap of 4,000 to 6,000 megawatts now to stop load shedding and keep electricity supply stable. Then we need an additional 4,000 to 6,000 megawatts for people to even start thinking about building a factory, about starting a new manufacturing line for renewables or doing anything like that. And it's such a pervasive problem that if you even think about our unemployment situation, I mean, what is it now, 34, 35%?
Depends which figure.
Yeah. And if you want to tackle unemployment successfully, right, what do? You need to create jobs. What's the quickest way to create jobs? Is you get industry to establish factories, you get them to establish manufacturing plants. We can't even get that right.
It's very important for people to realize that Eskom was built on very cheap coal, dirty coal, very bad coal actually. As the coal depletes, it's getting worse and worse. there are huge issues around air pollution. There's externality costs. Most of the generation of electricity happens up north, and lots of new energy requires more generation south, particularly in the coastal areas, high solar regions. But more importantly, unlike Europe, our grid is an island. If you had load shedding up to 8, even more, and the grid collapse, to repower the grid will take a long time, because we'll have to find ways to do that. Yeah. But let's talk about the book itself on sabotage. And do you want to pick up 2 or 3 things about sabotage and what it's doing to Eskom? And secondly, you do a very good profile of Jan Obelhauser, who was the CEO, and he's had a past history of working in Eskom, and under a director who worked at Sasol, etc. We in South Africa, in our politics, we tend to rely on great figureheads. We don't build institutions. Is there a concern that in the early phase of their appointment, there were huge attacks on them, race or whatever the issues are? So just to talk about some elements of that, and then later on we should talk about how do we build strong institutions that are not dependent on particular individuals and their charisma and so on. We have that with the president as well, Ramaphosa, although the charisma is falling a little bit. But if you can just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So back in the late 90s, as South Africa was transitioning to democracy, there was a guy at Eskom called Dr. Ian McRae, who is known as father of Eskom, father of electricity. He's one of the first people, I think, who worked in a government institution to realize that transition was coming, and he already started planning on how to electrify townships, how they were actually. He already started planning that before the election ever even happened, which is fascinating. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us, and I say unfortunately because Eskom is the kind of place, it's so big, and it has such an important job to do, that you have to sort of drive this sort of culture of prestasie, is the Afrikaans word for it.
Prestige.
Prestige. You have to sort of drive that. You have to instill in people a desire to do better and be better, and because Eskom used to be a place that used to research some of the best power generation technologies in the world. The first air-cooled coal-fired power station, Eskom technology. And Eskom was selling that technology to other parts of the world, and within a few years, all of that stopped. It fell apart. They stopped training people, and it started just going downhill. Now, even you mentioned earlier that you used to read the Eskom balance sheets and used to see them in the black. And even at that time, in 2001, when Eskom was voted the best in the world, the decay had already started. And that's sort of shocking when you think about that for a second, is how that happens in front of your eyes without realizing it. And that's where the sabotage comes in. So we have a situation where Eskom's had 10 or 11 CEOs in the past decade. De Ruyter is now officially the second longest serving CEO since Thulani Kabashe in 2007.
We've had 10 or 11 already.
Yes, And Oberholzer is someone who grew up in an Eskom house. His father worked for Eskom for 25 years. He's got his sister at one point was an admin clerk in an Eskom office somewhere. His uncle was a linesman. His father built transmission lines. He's Eskom through and through. I mean, this man, when you see him walk in and he's got blue pants on, even on a Sunday, then okay, no, this man works for Eskom, And he spent himself 25 years and then at Eskom, and then around 2008, he was deeply involved in the conceptualization around building of new power stations. And of course, Medupi and Kusile were happening at the time. And Medupi and Kusile needed these boilers, and of course, this ANC-linked company, Chancellor House, was awarded that contract. And Jan was actually supposed to sign the contract, and he resigned. He walked away. He said, I can't do this. And he spent 10 years in the private sector, and then decided to come back to Eskom. He credits his wife for saying to him, well, maybe it's time to go back and do what you actually want to do. And he agreed. He could obviously make a lot more money in the private sector. He's hugely experienced. And when he went back in June of 2018, he went back to a brand new position that had been created because Eskom had then had a CEO, Pakamani Hadebe, who was not an engineer, who didn't know the business. So they needed someone who could run the operation side of the business while you have a technically, financially minded person looking after the money. And that's the situation we have now. We have these two figureheads who work very closely with the board and who also work very closely with a team of senior managers who both run, three of them, they run transmission, generation, and distribution. And at the moment, I think the Eskom management team is the most well-rounded, most well-qualified management team that the company has had in the past decade. And it's difficult to reconcile that with the fact that we still have load shedding.
Right.
Something is not working. And this is what we started picking up, in our research for News 24, is that there were literally people breaking things on purpose. Literally.
Tutuka was one of them, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So Tutuka, it's, even in my mind, it's
Sorry,
the
that's a power station.
Yes.
So
it's a power station in Mpumalanga. Right. It is, to give you an idea, it went from being sort of the third, fourth best performing power station about 12 years ago to now being the second worst performing power station. And I say the second worst because Duva Power Station, also in Mpumalanga, is the worst performing one, and that one literally has 2 units that do not work ever at all. So that should give you an idea of how bad Tutuka is. Tutuka is the same place where, when the Reiter arrived at Eskom in 2020, they found out that 1.3 billion rands worth of spares had just simply gone missing.
You're right about that. Yeah. Incredible.
1.3 billion.
Unbelievable. I'm going to come back. I'm going to come to you now. You read the book. First of all, just thank you for giving your time, because I know you're very busy. Also, you're spending time reading the book. But you do have a vision for the city. There's a couple of other cities also, metros. Let's call them metros, because they have only metros that have good balance sheets are able to actually ask for special permission to. And you may want to talk about that. Is this a silent revolution that you see happening, that cities are going to play a bigger role?
Absolutely.
And if you can just explain, what the city of Cape Town is doing and why you're doing it.
Sure. So firstly, the book is fascinating because in Parliament, in the finance portfolio for the last decade, I thought I knew what was going on at Eskom and had looked at the finances and the balance sheet 100 times.
Was this under SCOPA?
No, at SCOF, the Standing Committee on Finance, yeah. And to get some detailed inside understanding of exactly how these scandals went down, it is much more shocking and extraordinary than you would have picked up from reading the newspaper on a daily basis, as we all have done. And really, Kyle builds this impression, I think absolutely accurate, of Eskom being turned into this enormous national ATM, basically, for everyone who wanted to get rich quickly. And that's the way it's been treated for the last 15 years at least.
Yeah.
And he just picks up a few stories to show how that's happened. But it's just from everything from fuel oil, which I didn't actually know existed until I read the book, to tea and coffee, and then of course the big kahuna, the massive one which hasn't even yet been touched, which you say, and I think that's so true, is you deal with the boilers, the Hitachi ANC link, but the one that hasn't yet been touched is the coal contracts and the transport contracts. That's the biggest milking cow of them all. So really fascinating. So let me do the right thing and start by saying, please buy the book and read it.
I was going to say that at the end. I'll say it in the end as well.
But, I just want to pick up on what Carl said about what it does to the economy. There's no doubt that load shedding is the biggest handbrake on the South African economy. And when I was thinking about running to be the mayor, I literally wrote down on one piece of paper, roughly this size, what are the things that I think are holding back the country the most, and what can we at a local government level do about it? And obviously number one on that list was load shedding. And the more that I read about it and spoke to Green Cape, I know you're involved in Green Cape a lot, and spoke to some other experts, the more I realized, without any technical understanding of power generation at all, there just doesn't seem to be any good technical reason why we have load shedding in South Africa still, 15 years later. All of the reasons are actually political. They're about not signing power purchase agreements. They're about protecting the coal monopoly, and not actually about whether the technology is available to end this now. Of course it's available. So you've actually just got to have the political will to press into that space. And so we've done that quite aggressively, and the idea is to reduce our reliance on Eskom by between 15 and 20%. So people say, well, that sounds very small, but actually that's all we need. That's the gap that we need to make up to end stage 5 load shedding. And so that's what we push. That's our primary objective in Cape Town, is to essentially be immune from stage 5 load shedding by the end of the next 4 years or so. And that requires buying a lot of independent power, about 300 megawatts in the first round. And then, for obvious reasons, you've got to have a way of storing that power, because renewable power is not available when you need it. And so in energy speak, as I've come to learn, that is called dispatchable power. Dispatchable as in available at the flick of a switch. So later this year, maybe January, we will go to market on a big storage dispatchable power tender.
Will this be battery or?
Well, actually, we're not technology agnostic. So we're just saying to the market, give us your ideas on dispatchable power. And we've recently decided to remove the cap on that, because we're already seeing a future where we increase the IPP purchase beyond 300 megs, which in Eskom world is a tiny number. I mean, you've just heard that 46,000 megs nationally. But that's what we need now to deal with load shedding. And when those two things come together, a new supply of power that doesn't come from Eskom, and the ability to store it, you can then deploy it, dispatch it, as I said, when you need it, and you can actually start to end load shedding. Now, since we've done that, there's been a couple of legal questions. Firstly, do we need this famous thing called Section 34 determination? And
which the minister controls.
Yeah, exactly. This is ministerial permission to buy new power. It's an absurd idea that you have to ask for permission to buy power in a country where there's not enough power. So we've just said we're going to actually go ahead without ministerial determination. We wrote a nice letter to say, please let us know if you object to this. Otherwise, we're going ahead. Since then, actually, in the middle of that stage 6 crisis we had, what was it, 2 months ago now, where we had those 3 terrible weeks of regular stage 6 outages. That was, in a sense, a really useful crisis for South Africa, because the president then finally came out and said, we just blow aside all of these things, no more Section 34 determination required. So that's since been clarified. And we now see a Kuruleni Metro, for example, pressing ahead without Section 34 determination. And we've seen massive interest from other cities, all calling us up saying, how do we catch up now? So, so we've actually got a great thing now happening, where we've got some healthy competition. eThekwini, I see, has gone to market. Tshwane has gone to market on a big thing. They got into a bit of hot water about it, but I think they'll get there. The point is, what I've learned personally is that this is a very complicated procurement space. And it's unprecedented. No one yet, for example, has done a utility scale storage tender in South Africa. We will be the first in December. So, I would have loved to have done that 6 months ago already. But just writing those tender specs has been so complex, and again, Green Cape has been hugely helpful there, that it's taken longer than I would have liked. But it is a complex but very rapidly developing space, and very exciting.
Can I ask you 2 questions related to metros? The one is that there's a lot of individuals that want to do rooftop PV. And the city's got some rules on net metering. Net metering basically means you could sell your surplus electricity into the grid, especially if we don't have household storage. How far has that gone? Because I know there was some pioneering work done, particularly in Drakenstein municipality and so on. And then the second one is really around how you've managed to reduce your load shedding in Cape Town.
Sure. Okay, so firstly, I'm really proud of this innovation. I think it's the first in the whole of Africa that we are paying cash for people's power. We've started with just businesses, anyone with a large roof space, factories, warehouses, distribution centers, shopping centers, and so on. And they sell us excess power, and we will pay them. We'll actually EFT them at the end of the month for that cash, and that's important.
That's implemented already.
We've just closed the registration round, and the first payments will happen in October. Okay. And the idea is to get the payment system working perfectly because it's new, and then we can roll it out to households as well. So I mean we're trying to bring down the cost as well of net metering because there's quite an expensive meter that you have to install. At the moment, there's only one approved meter.
You feel that's incentivizing households to do more PV?
I hope so. I mean, we've got an incentive tariff, so we are paying households more than we pay Eskom actually for the power, and so we really hope that does act as an incentive. But to be honest with you, the business case, the economic case for households is still much less attractive than the economic case for a business with a huge roof. Right. Because there's just economies of scale in the capital, the upfront capital costs that you can do with a massive roof that you can't with a house. So that's the PV space. At the moment, we use this wonderful 40-year-old piece of machinery that just hums like a
down the road here.
Yeah, like an absolute gem called Steenbras Hydro Pump Storage Station, built in 1979. And the key thing, people often say, well, Cape Town can't really take credit for Steenbras, but this is what I love about the Cape Town Energy team. You visit that facility, you can eat off the floor. It is spotlessly clean. It works like a 1979. I don't know, Mercedes S500 or something. It just purrs, and it is beautifully maintained, and that is why it is probably the most efficient after Coburg, the most efficient power station in the country. I don't know that for certain, but I'm pretty sure that's true.
It's right up there.
So that gives us. It has 4 units, and we can use those units we can switch them on during load shedding. And then you run water down the mountain essentially and you generate hydroelectricity. And the key limiting factor, the reason we can't do that with infinitely is because the lower dam fills up quite quickly. So once the lower dam is full, if you think of it like a battery, when the lower dam is full, it basically means the battery's empty. And so you've got to wait a few days to pump the water back up the mountain. And then empty the lower dam. And so what we are looking at now is how to expand the size of the lower dam, to excavate more space there. But here's the interesting thing, just to go back to something Carl was saying earlier. The last 6 months, we've done a lot of preparation for stage 8 load shedding to try and get, and I totally agree with Carl, that is a picture you never want to see in South Africa. Never mind the riots and the looting and that, but every single basic service, we do not have enough diesel or enough diesel generators to keep our water filtration pump stations working to keep.
So the essential services
will start to collapse probably within 48 hours actually, because eventually diesel will become such a hot commodity. There will be so much competition.
Might be an
for
opportunity
diesel.
for car power, by the way.
Yeah. So we've actually, for example, one small change. We've got 15 diesel stores in the city. We used to fill those once a month. We now fill them.
At the storage facilities.
Yeah, massive storage facilities, hundreds of thousands of liters of diesel that we store for our generators. We used to fill them once a month. We now fill them twice a week. Wow! Just to be prepared, so that if this happens, we've got the most. We've got full stores. We've gone through some detailed planning for stage 8, but what it meant was that during that stage 6 load shedding 2 months ago, we actually had an entire half of Steenbras, 2 units at Steenbras were kept in reserve that we didn't use to actually ameliorate load shedding when we could have. Why? For that startup procedure. Because if there is a national shutdown, you've got to have some spare capacity somewhere to actually start up the entire grid again.
That's right.
And so we had kept half of Steenbras in complete reserve
In case of
the worst case scenario. So it is really something that we desperately want to avoid as a country and as a city. And that's, so I hope that we can get those IPPs onto the grid as fast as we can.
One more good news story from your side, because we've had lots, and I'll come back to you, Carl. Yesterday I was reading, I think it was in the Mail and Guardian, that if you were to procure all this power, you'd have tariffs that are 30% lower than, and just related to that, but municipalities depend a lot on electricity revenue. So how do you balance the books with this level of self-power and being able to generate sufficient revenue to keep your balance sheet and your creditworthiness?
And municipal finance managers across the country, CFOs, are really panicky about this. And that's true in Cape Town as well. Because the future is that the electricity business model is dying.
Right.
You don't need any expert to tell you that. Just look at a graph of electricity sales at a municipal level. The business model is dying. So it is a case of you can't avoid business model reform, which I think is great for the country. The way that you can get to cheaper tariffs, let me just explain that quickly. The power that we're buying now, this 300 megawatts, is significantly cheaper than Eskom power.
Right.
Because renewables are now basically a fraction of the cost. So even if you add the cost of storage, which is still to come, as I said, the second part of that puzzle, you get to a total cost of new power that is less than Eskom's highest megaflex rate, which is about £4.70 or something.
For what they sell on to municipalities?
Yeah, we pay the megaflex rate, which is the highest Eskom rate, peak tariff. So the costs are very favorable. So over time, the more you can reduce your reliance on Eskom and increase your reliance on renewables and storage, you can actually pass on those savings to consumers. And here's how it helps the financial model. You can still retain your margin. If we're paying £4 to Eskom, and let's say with storage costs we can deliver it for £3.50, theoretically there's actually a 50% extra margin, 50 cents, extra margin in this example for the municipality. Now what you could do is pass on 40 cents of that and keep a portion of it. So you have to reach a certain level of scale before this business model flips, but it is going to happen. There's no doubt in my mind that it's going to happen because the old business model is dying as people go off the grid. So municipalities have to adapt. And the way that we can adapt is by investing heavily in renewables as fast as we can. Because ideally, what we want to be able to do is offer you, as a resident, say, you don't need to go and spend the 200 grand to make your house green, because actually we've already done it. We've taken on the capital cost at a citywide level. We've secured you from load shedding. If your business cares about green energy, we've given you green energy. And you can actually have cheaper tariffs at the same time.
Can I just ask you one more question? Sorry, Carl, I'm going to come back to you. There are lots of other constituencies that can't afford electricity. So there's the basic electricity provision. How would the city manage that with this kind of transition that you are, which we're going to be forced into, so we can't get out of it?
No, you're still always going to have a base load, which is why we can never fully cut the umbilical cord with Eskom, because renewables are just not permanently available and reliable. And you have to be able to have that base load that you can supply to informal settlements, that you can supply our constitutional requirement for free basic electricity units. So there's going to be an extent to which that's always going to be the case, and we will always have to do that. There's some exciting stuff happening around the concepts of microgrids, which you can do in informal settlements, where you have a containerized battery with solar panels covering the outside of the container, and that can provide power for several hundred residents. But that's still some way off. You've got to figure out how to protect that infrastructure. You've got to figure out where to put it. So that's still some way off.
Just on microgrids, I mean, it's worth looking at what's happening in Nigeria, DRC, Senegal. It's really starting to take off in a big time. Still, the cost of actually putting those microgrid facilities is still expensive. But outside of South Africa, there's a massive microgrid, because they can't build huge transmission line. Kyle, you must have talked to ADR about the future of Eskom.
Yeah.
As you know, they won't be there forever. What are the plans that they see for reducing South Africa's dependency on one single utility? There are reforms in place. And we've only talked about generation, corruption in generation. Medupi is 3 times the cost of all large projects, by the way.
Yeah.
Building another nuclear plant will have cost overruns for sure, even corruption. So one, there's the whole just transition platform that's being set up, the repurposing of coal plants, etc. So what do you see as their vision? How do we get out of the Eskom rut? And what's the, you've told the bad story, but what's the good story going forward? Because the crisis does lead to change, right? I mean, we're starting to see that.
I'm going to have to disappoint you.
Okay.
There's no good news.
It's no good news.
And the reason for that is a guy by the name of Gwede Mantashe,
Right.
and the political party he's affiliated to called the ANC. I think the electricity policy and centralization of electricity generation and distribution comes from, I don't know, it's 1970. Someone gave them a textbook from Russia or something, I don't know. And they've stuck to that solidly. They believe that this is the only way to go through. They're married to coal. They don't...
It's gas now also.
Well, and this is the next thing. This is the next fad that they've gotten involved in, with these stupid power ships that are going to cost way too much money. But they are not thinking about the future. And I recently wrote in an opinion piece for News 24 that the president should fire Mantashe immediately, like on the spot, because he's just, clueless. And then he's arrogant about what he did.
They can't fire the chair of...
No. He goes on TV and says, oh, well, Eskom's got 15,000 megawatts just lying around. Why don't they just use it? And I'm like, well, can someone please just sit down and explain that to the man who's actually the energy minister of the country, why those 15,000 megawatts are not available right now? And unfortunately, I don't think he answers to the people of South Africa. I don't think he cares. I think he's more worried about other things. So when I spoke to people at Eskom, and I'm not going to mention any specific names here in fear of getting people into trouble, there's a massive amount of frustration over a lack of good policy, a lack of policy integration. The existing policies don't speak.
It's worth explaining to people that his hands are also tied, right?
Exactly.
Highly dependent on...
Andre de Ruyter, he's the CEO of Eskom. He cannot go out to market and procure more power. He cannot build a new power station. The Department of Mineral Resources and Energy is the only department that can do that, and it doesn't even have political oversight of Eskom. The Department of Public Enterprises has, So there's this mismatch of, and nobody really knows what, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and the right hand's just doing whatever it wants anyway. It's not really looking at the situation on the ground and making smart decisions. And I've been arguing this again and again every time I speak about the book, and people say to me, okay, so what is the sabotage? And I'll tell them, the theme that the current the undercurrent that runs throughout the book is that the biggest amount of sabotage has been perpetrated by the ANC government in terms of bad policy, in terms of not thinking about energy future, in terms of sticking to rent extraction networks.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's as the mayor mentioned, coal. If I had to start working on coal and including it in this book would have been 1,000 pages long, because...
We hope your second book will cover that.
The coal mafia, as we call them, because it operates like a mafia, and it is dirty and it is thuggish, and people get killed all the time. There's a young woman at Eskom who was found buried underneath coal at one of the power stations, and I've been trying for more than a year and a half. They've got the guys who murdered her on CCTV. They've got I haven't even written the story yet, because we're still trying to just get the police to do their job, and it just, nothing happens. So this is the kind of thing that's happening on the ground. People are speaking up because they see coal trucks dropping coal off where they're not supposed to, or they're doing this, and they just get murdered. So it's something that I will get stuck into at some point, but I do have a lot of safety considerations around it as well, you know, so I have to start thinking about that before I dig into it. But it's going to require, as you say, something needs to change, and it needs to change fundamentally. The president coming out and lifting the cap of embedded generation, which is, you know, the amount of electricity a business can generate without having to apply for a license. Geordin Hill-Lewis wanted 10 megawatts.
Yeah.
The president put it at 100,
That's
which
right.
fantastic for him.
Well, actually, the cap is not necessary. As
Yeah,
well.
they should remove the cap completely because no mine is going to build a 1,000 megawatt power station.
Right.
They are not challenging your monopoly.
Right.
The mine is going to build just enough with a little bit of a margin to operate their own business and then feed the rest into the grid because it costs a lot of money. So no one is going to say, oh, there's no cap, let's go and build a massive, you know, 5,000 megawatt coal-fired power station and sell the electricity to people because it's stupid. It takes 10 years to build the thing and it costs, you know, 150, 60 billion rand. So this is the kind of very basic thinking that needs to start happening at the union buildings and in cabinet. You know, fire the man, fire Geordin Hill-Lewis. He is too old, he doesn't understand what's going on, and he is too married to rent-seeking patronage networks that we don't need in this country. Get rid of him, get someone young with, you know, the spirit and the verve and the energy and the brains to actually understand energy policy. And stop listening to people who make money out of the energy sector to make your policy for you.
You might have to wait till 2024 for that. But
I just want to,
sorry, go ahead.
I just want to build on the theme of rent seeking. I think he's the acting director general at the moment of the National Treasury, Ishmael Mamonia.
That's right,
Yes.
yeah.
Said something extraordinary in an interview a couple of weeks ago, which I saw the Kasatu went nuts about, and an organization called the BBC, the Black Business Council, also was a little bit hot under the collar about this. But he said that preferential procurement in South Africa is entrenched corruption, has become entrenched corruption.
Wow.
An extraordinary thing for the
And
acting
he's a
DG of the
stalwart,
Treasury.
by the way, of the
Yeah. Of the National Treasury to say. But you see this come out so clearly in the Eskom stories that it is actually just entrenched corruption. And, you know, I always chuckle when Gwede is painted as this kind of champion of the ordinary coal worker, the coal miner. He's nothing of the sort. He's a champion of the coal mafia who have treated Eskom as their milking cow for decades and have made tens of billions of rands at the public expense while that institution has fallen apart and continue to do so. And that's what it's about. It's about rent extraction.
And I think in your book on Econ Oil, that's a brilliant example of how that operates. I want to give the audience, nobody would have thought that electricity is an interesting topic in South Africa. So we're going to take one question at a time. So I don't know if you can just put your hands up. And if you could just mention your name, please. Yes, please. Yes.
Good morning. My name is...
There's a microphone over there. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Irene. My question is for the mayor. It's a two-part question. The first part is to better understand the strategy of reducing reliance on Eskom power. So is the future IPPs with renewable energy generation capacity and storage capacity solely, or is it meant to be complementary with also encouraging households and businesses to build additional renewable generation capacity? And the second question, or the second part of my question is, if there is a complementary strategy with encouraging households to build more renewable energy generation capacity, are there plans or additional options for incentives to make the economics work better for households, for instance, rebates on city property rates, etc.? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
I
you
think
so
you've
much.
sort of answered it, but...
On the first part of your question, it's definitely complementary. That's why, for example, we've started now the policy evolution or innovation of paying people for the first time for the power that they produce, first at a commercial level for factories and warehouses, but once the payment system is running smoothly and tested at the residential level as well. We also pay an incentive tariff already. And I've just approved that incentive tariff for the next 3 years. I wish I could actually approve it for a longer timeline so that you could have some security that you would have that incentive tariff for 5 years or 7 years. But local government works on a 3-year budgeting cycle.
Yeah,
so
that's your municipal finance management.
Exactly, yeah. We have something called an MTREF. So I'm only legally allowed to, I can say verbally now, it is absolutely my intention to extend it past that, but there's nothing passed by council that will, that's bankable. So we pay that incentive tariff. We're looking to try and bring down the cost of installation. We require certain safety checks by an electrical engineer, a certain kind of SABS approved meter, which is quite expensive. We're looking at finding cheaper ways to do that for households so that we can bring down the upfront cost. In terms of actual subsidies over and above the incentive tariff that we pay, it's tough. I have a justice, like an equity concern around doing that, because the households who are most able to invest in renewable power are by definition some of the most well-off households in the city. And I need to get my head around whether the city should be actively subsidizing those kind of households to make that investment, when really we have so much work to do among the poorest residents in our city to deliver more dignity and better services and better infrastructure to them. So I think that what I want to do is just try and make it easier for those households to do it themselves, and then to buy the power from them. And the power is not, at the moment, the price that we pay for the power is itself an additional little incentive, because we actually pay just slightly, nothing luxurious, a few cents more than we pay Eskom. So we're paying a little incentive there as well. But I think that gap's going to widen as the Eskom price continues to skyrocket. And so that, that incentive will become more and more attractive. So there's no doubt in my mind that over the next few years, it will become a more attractive space for people to invest in this. But primarily, our focus has to be on those where we can get the biggest yield. 80% of the power that we buy is going to come from the really big roof spaces.
Can I just ask, related to that, do you have a sense of how many firms and properties are putting up?
We're going to get a good sense now, because we've just put out this request to sell us power.
Right.
It actually closed at the end of August, so I need to hear how many we got. But I suspect that it will be, in the first round, probably no more than a few hundred big roof spaces. I'm talking about 1 megawatt or 50 kilowatts, or a couple hundred kilowatts, whatever. So I think it will be no more than a few hundred in the first round. Of course, there are tens of thousands of residents who would like to do that. And as the economic case gets better over the next few years, I think more of them will.
Okay. Carl, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, the mayor mentioned that Eskom tariffs are going to get more and more expensive. It's something that's just always sits with me. Eskom has had below cost tariffs for electricity for forever. They don't recover enough money to actually keep Eskom running from the tariffs that they charge. And again, this massive centralized system that sells power nationally, it's unaffordable, it's cumbersome, it can't work. So just prepare yourself that if NERSA eventually allows Eskom to recover tariffs that Eskom really wants, so they can start fixing power stations, it's going to become enormously expensive to have electricity in your house. It's an unfortunate reality.
But there's also a benefit, right, in generating power closer to the user, because if you transfer electricity from 2,000 kilometers away, there's a loss.
Efficiency loss,
about 16 up to 20%.
Yes, correct.
So, any other questions? Yes, sir. If you can just mention your name. Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to give you a microphone, if you don't mind.
I can speak up.
I think they want to record
the
it.
chaps at the back won't hear you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Lester. There's lots of talk about the words just transition. And my understanding is that just transition refers to justice, some restorative justice, or some sort of, some sort of way that this energy reform process, sort of gives back to people and doesn't just focus on, necessarily those people who work in coal jobs. So I'm keen to hear from all of you, or like what other aspects of this just transition do not get spoken about in the media, because and that it's not just the transition.
Carl?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So obviously, as you say, you know, the just transition is not just about leaving coal miners behind. It's also about, you know, being just to the environment. It's about being just to people who previously didn't have electricity, cannot afford electricity. So it's a very wide encompassing sort of do good initiative. Let's try and move away from pollution or you know, methods of generating electricity that cause pollution, while not cutting off hundreds of thousands of jobs overnight and leaving people without an income. There are towns in Mpumalanga that rely completely on the coal mining economy. Those towns would have to shut down, and people would have to, you know, move their livelihoods. And then also, you know, I think Cape Town has a particular problem with this in terms of, you know, the geographical distribution of where people live and the inequality that those various areas have. So that is something that, you know, politically the mayor of, and you know, practically and politically the mayor of Cape Town and his political party are going to have to manage very, very carefully. But at the same time, they also don't call the policy shots. They have to implement basically what they can and when they can. So it's an enormously difficult thing, and you raise a very valuable point, and I think you've given me a wonderful story idea to write about the things that we never talk about in this transition. So thank you, Lester, for that. I really appreciate it.
If I could just add the one really fascinating technical point, which I think really helps with the just transition, is that the biggest grid capacity in South Africa is unsurprisingly in Mpumalanga. So the best place for renewable energy is not the Northern Cape, just because it's most sunny. The best place for renewable energy is in Mpumalanga, because there's no delay in connecting to the grid. The capacity is all there, whereas it's not there in the middle of the Karoo. So, you know, the other point to make is that it doesn't have to spell the end of coal just because South Africa isn't using it. There's still a massive export market, and we are doing that, but you know, to an ever lesser degree. The train line doesn't work from the coal fields in Mpumalanga to Richards Bay coal terminal, export terminal. It works intermittently at best.
It's half the capacity.
Yeah, it's the capacity has halved. So you could still have, for many, many years to come, the South African coal industry supporting coal users around the world, you know, very healthily, and still have renewable investment in Mpumalanga, where those people work, right next to where the grid capacity is. But you need to have someone who understands the future business model of how energy is going to work. And it's not pushing against the tide of history, like our national minister currently is. So I really agree that he needs to go. He needs a just transition out of the job.
He does have, by the way, a just energy transition unit. But just to say, on that particular issue, the Presidential Climate Commission has, they've run very good open processes, virtual meetings, where they have debated with a wide audience, different interests around the just transition. In fact, they have a series now, I think it's over 4 weeks, on the energy sector. It's worth you going on the website and also registering for events that are coming. And they're trying to tackle this particular issue. I do think that the most important thing that should be just is actually to stop corruption, right? Because you're diverting resources away from other types of social benefits that is not getting done because we have parasitic extraction of rents from the system. So the first call of justice is not just about the future energy system and how it creates jobs, it's actually trying to deal with the unjust issues.
Saliem, which is of course very, very difficult when the people tasked to clean up the corruption are involved in it.
Sure, and also we must also make sure that the IPPs are also free from this. One more question? Yes. I forget your name again?
Linda.
Linda, that's right, yes. And then we'll go at the back there. We literally got 6 minutes, so I want to give both of you 1 minute or 30 seconds to say something.
To the Mayor, I just want to find out, you've got plans in place for a stage 8 load shedding. I mean, how realistic and how incorporated into your thinking is that possibility? And what is the capacity of the storage, the dispatchable storage battery that you put out for tender? Thank you.
Thank you.
You're saying how well prepared are we, or how likely do we expect it? Oh, so I had this very funny conversation, which I don't mind mocking him about publicly, with Andre de Ruyter in about February this year in our first meeting. I said, look, how worried do I need to be about stage 6 and above? And he said, no, look, I mean, that's just not going to happen. It's very unlikely. So I had great pleasure in SMSing him during the stage 6 and saying...
was this before the stage 6?
Yeah, this was back in February, March. Okay. So when that happened, we got our disaster risk management team together, all of our basic services, sewage, water, electricity, and we started to come up with detailed plans for how to handle stage 8. It's not pretty. It's not pretty. So we will handle it as best we can. Let's put it that way. But it really won't be pleasant. But I think that the risk of that has receded quite a lot. I think that there is still reasonable risk of stage 6 happening again. But I just really hope our approach. Let me put it this way, Linda. Our approach has been, I trust that Andre and Jan and the team are getting it slowly but surely under control, and that risk is slowly receding, but we are going to prepare for the worst in any case, and just be as well prepared as we can. Yeah. Then on the dispatchable tender, we've actually removed the cap. So we had planned on a cap of 500 megawatts. We've decided really what is the point of the cap. If the price still comes in at under Eskom, then we may as well buy as much as the market offers.
So you could end up with much more then.
So we've just removed the cap. It will be capless, uncapped.
I'm going to take one more question at the back there, and if you can give the microphone. Thanks. And then we're just going to try to conclude. It's been really fascinating, I have to say.
I'm Khadija. I just want to know from the panel, there have been concerns, of course, around sabotage and extortion gangs also targeting key infrastructure areas, and how does that then play into the situation that we are experiencing now in terms of having the local production of electricity, and then also looking at how it's impacting on some of the greater concerns around energy production in the country?
So it's a really good question. So let me give you an example. In the beginning of my book, I talk about a power station named Letabo. It's Eskom's best running power station. They toppled a pylon over nearly stage 6 load shedding, because it was already stage 2 load shedding. You live in Cape Town, if I'm not mistaken. That power station's in Vereniging. It's 1,000 odd kilometers away from you. So if you had stage 6 load shedding that day, that power station 1,000 kilometers away that you've probably never seen with your own two eyes is the reason that you were struggling to cook food on a gas plate stove in the corner somewhere. And that just never ever made sense to me. It's never made sense to me that we have this massive gargantuan, system that is Eskom. It procures 120 billion rands worth of goods a year. The opportunities for corruption are limitless. Yeah. Limitless. You can steal literally you can make money on pens to milk to toilet paper up to a 15 billion rand tender to refurbish a nuclear power plant. It's just too big for one person or one executive team sitting in Johannesburg to manage. And if you have any problem, if it's smaller, it becomes more manageable. But now you have 16 power stations that are, they're
always in trouble.
People infiltrating those power stations, toppling pylons, throwing bolts into nuclear reactors and all sorts of things, And you can never, ever really put your finger on it, because it's so big and it's so large and it's so spread all over the place that you can't ever really police it. So if you have a smaller system, a smaller grid, one city looking after its own electricity.
Far more decentralized.
Far more decentralized. And then it's also easier to hold people accountable. If Cape Town doesn't have electricity, it's the mayor's fault. You know, it's not some guy in Joburg.
Quite right.
So may
right.
not sabotage in the book, but sabotage outside of the book. How do you guys deal with that?
That's a great question, Khadija. This is a rising concern in everyone's minds in South Africa. Everything is now subject to extortion gangs. Every construction site, every bit of work that goes on in a community, it's really very alarming. We don't have a lot of time to get into this in detail. I'll just leave you with one thought. What's concerning to me is how little progress organizations like the SSA, the State Security Agency, like crime intelligence, have made into these new forms of highly organized, very violent crime gangs. This extortion is not being done by, you know, some dude with a knife or a gun in a community. These are well organized. They have got 4x4 vehicles. They've got armored vehicles. They've got high-powered weaponry. These are organized criminal syndicates, and we have not made any inroads into cracking them in any major way. And that concerns me about what SSA and crime intelligence are actually doing. You know, what are they focusing on? I struggle to think of any major criminal success that they have had in South Africa in the last couple of years. And their absence is really felt. Those are two other institutions whose collapse we need to talk about at some stage, because their absence is really felt.
I have to conclude this. I just wanted to thank Kyle and the mayor. But Kyle, maybe you want to think about the stuff you can't say factually, but fictionally. You might want to write a fiction story about all the real true stories of what's going on. And you can put different names on the characters. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. I just want to say to Kyle, thank you very much for writing the book. I understand the safety concerns, and so thanks for your bravery in going and uncovering and explaining these stories to us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. And please buy the book. He's here to sign them. Thank you, Mayor.